All right, so we're going to dive into something today that I'm pretty sure a lot of you probably learned about in school at some point,
Uh-huh.
the Alaska Purchase.
Right.
But I'm going to guess that not a whole lot of you learned about the late night poker game that kind of set the whole thing in motion.
Yeah, that's not really you don't really hear about high stakes card games shaping, the destiny of nations every day, but
Hmm.
that's kind of what happened back in March of 1867.
Wow. So I'm picturing like this smoke-filled room,
Oh, yeah.
maybe some guys in there with some fancy cigars and
Absolutely.
some drinks, and they're all raising their eyebrows when Secretary of State William Seward
Right.
suddenly gets word that he's got to meet with a Russian minister, like right away.
Urgently, yeah.
What could be so important that it couldn't wait till the next morning?
Well, the Russians were ready to sell Alaska,
Hmm.
and Seward, being the opportunist that he was about to pull off, I think, one of the most audacious deals in American history.
It's crazy to think about it. Twice the size of Texas for only $7.2 million.
It's an incredible deal.
A deal that people are still talking about today. But let's go a little deeper than just the headlines.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because a lot of people see Seward as this visionary leader,
Right.
a man who saw Alaska's potential when everyone else was laughing at him.
Yeah, and to be fair to him, he did have a grand vision,
Okay.
and that vision was kind of fueled by some hard lessons from the Civil War.
So what did the Civil War teach him about America and its vulnerabilities?
Well, the war had really kind of shown everyone where the gaps were in America's defenses, especially when you think about its huge coastline.
Right.
And Seward was really influenced by this. I mean, he really saw Alaska as this like strategic linchpin in the Pacific.
Hmm.
He was envisioning this network of naval bases, control of all these important trade routes to the east, and access to tons of natural resources.
So he was playing the long game then, huh?
Oh, yeah.
Securing America's future on the world stage.
Absolutely.
But how did he convince a skeptical Senate to go along with such a bold move?
Well, he pulled out all the stops, lavish dinners, backroom deals, these really impassioned speeches where he emphasized, Alaska's untapped riches.
Wow.
He even argued that buying this huge territory would help America solidify its influence as, a rising global power.
He must have been quite the salesman because, I mean, come on, $7.2 million for a big chunk of land that a lot of people consider just a frozen wasteland.
Yeah.
It's a tough sell.
It is. And, while a lot of people think that everyone was making fun of him at the time, that wasn't really the whole story.
Oh, really?
Our sources actually show that there was quite a bit of support for the purchase in newspapers all over the country.
Huh. So public opinion wasn't totally against it.
Right.
But there's another side to all this that we need to talk about, a perspective that often gets overshadowed by all the politics and strategic talk.
Exactly. What about the people who were already living there?
The native people of Alaska.
Right. The people who had called this land home for centuries, suddenly they're caught in the middle of this big geopolitical chess match.
It's crazy to think about what it must have been like for them to watch this transfer of power happen.
Well, for the Tlingit people, it was just another chapter in this long and complicated story of outsiders coming in and trying to change their way of life.
And that history wasn't exactly peaceful, was it?
No, not at all.
I mean, you just have to look at something like the Refuge Rock Massacre back in 1784.
A really horrible event. Hundreds of Tlingit people killed by Russian fur traders.
Oh, wow.
Just a stark reminder of the kind of violence that was so common between indigenous people and colonial powers.
So when they had the handover ceremony in Sitka,
Right.
with the Russian flag coming down and the American flag going up, I imagine the Tlingit people must have been watching with a lot of worry and uncertainty.
Absolutely. I mean, they just saw this transfer of ownership, but what did it really mean for them and their future?
Right, their culture.
Yeah.
It must have felt like they were stuck between a rock and a hard place,
Yeah.
trading one colonial power for another.
Mm-hmm.
And as we'll see, their fears weren't unfounded at all.
So, the transition from Russian to American rule wasn't exactly, smooth and easy.
Right?
The Tlingit people had kind of gotten used to a certain level of autonomy
Huh.
and respect under the Russians. I mean, they had these trade relationships and, pretty complex social structures, and they even held some positions of authority within the Russian administration.
That's interesting. So they weren't completely unfamiliar with the idea of outsiders having some influence,
Right.
but I'm guessing the American approach was a little bit different.
It was, yeah. The U.S. Army was in charge of keeping things in order in this new territory.
Right.
And they came in with a much stricter, less accommodating kind of attitude.
Mm.
They saw the Tlingit people in a completely different way. not as partners or people to work with, but as people they had to control.
So it sounds like there was this clash of cultures happening.
Oh, definitely.
And our sources show that it didn't take very long for things to get really tense.
Yeah.
There's this one account of a Tlingit chief who is harassed and even attacked by an American soldier.
Yeah. That was a big turning point. It wasn't just some random act of aggression,
Right.
It was like this blatant disregard for Tlingit leadership and a total violation of their customs.
I can't imagine how angry and humiliated the Tlingit people must have felt.
Yeah.
So how did they respond?
They weren't just going to sit back and take it. They stood up for their leader and they made it clear that they weren't going to let anyone walk all over them.
Wow.
That first confrontation led to a whole bunch of clashes between the Tlingit and the U.S. Army,
Oh, wow.
and people were killed on both sides.
That's terrible. And it sounds like things got even worse from there.
Yeah, they did. The situation just spiraled out of control, and it ended with the U.S. Army actually bombing a bunch of Tlingit villages.
Oh, my.
It was this awful show of force.
Right.
A clear message that they wouldn't put up with any resistance.
It's so different from those stories about Seward's big triumphant visit to Sitka in 1869.
Right.
And here he was standing on Tlingit land talking about all of Alaska's amazing potential.
Yeah.
But it's like he completely ignored the people who had lived there for generations.
It is kind of ironic.
Yeah.
Seward, the guy who made this whole purchase happen, seemed to be totally blind to the human cost of what he was doing.
Mm.
He even predicted that Alaska's native people would just disappear,
Wow.
that they'd be replaced by American progress and industry.
And in a way, he wasn't totally wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, the Alaska Purchase did lead to a lot of development and change,
Yeah.
but it came at a huge cost for the Tlingit people.
Absolutely.
Their land, their
Yeah.
culture, their whole way of life was threatened.
And, their response to all of this was really powerful and lasting.
What did they do?
They created this incredible symbol of resistance, the shame totem pole.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, it's this beautifully carved pole that stands tall in Sitka.
Right.
And it wasn't just a piece of art, it was a statement.
Oh, wow.
It actually has a caricature of Seward right at the top.
Really?
Yeah, it was this deliberate act of defiance, a way to show everyone the broken promises and the disrespect that the Tlingit people had to endure.
It's amazing how one object can hold so much history, so much pain, so much resilience.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible.
And to think that it all started with what seemed like a small cultural misunderstanding.
Yeah, that's history for you. It's often these tiny details that reveal all these bigger issues of power prejudice and cultural clashes. And the shame totem pole, which has been replaced and put back up over the years, is still there today as this powerful reminder of the Tlingit people's unwavering spirit and their fight for recognition.
It's also interesting that while Seward was getting all these gifts and praise during a potlatch ceremony,
Right.
he didn't give anything back,
Yeah.
which was a big no-no in Tlingit culture.
It was. It really showed the power dynamics at play.
Right.
Seward, maybe without realizing it, showed that he didn't really understand or respect Tlingit traditions.
And the Tlingit people, through the shame totem pole, made sure that their story, their perspective wouldn't be forgotten.
Right.
They were determined to be heard no matter what.
Mm.
When you think about it, it really makes you look at historical figures differently.
Yeah.
I mean, on one hand, you've got Seward, this guy with a grand vision for expansion.
Right. Yeah.
He's praised for being so ambitious and forward-thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's the Tlingit people whose lives were turned upside down.
Exactly.
Their culture was disrupted. Their land was taken away.
It's a perfect example of how history is usually told from the winner's point of view.
Right.
The Alaska Purchase is often celebrated as this great business deal, a huge win for the U.S.
Right.
But when you dig a little deeper, when you start to consider the voices of the people who were pushed aside and lost everything,
Yeah.
the story becomes a lot more complicated.
It reminds us that progress for some often means others have to pay the price.
Yeah,
It's a theme that keeps coming up throughout history.
definitely.
And it makes you ask this really important question.
What's that?
How do we make sense of these two sides of the story? The success of American expansion versus the displacement of native people.
It's a tough question.
It is. And it's a question that still matters in Alaska today.
Absolutely.
The fight for indigenous rights, for their land, for their culture to be recognized, it's not over.
The story doesn't end when a treaty is signed or a monument is built.
Right.
It's a constant struggle, a back and forth between the past and the present.
And I think that's one of the most important things we could take away from this deep dive.
Yeah.
It's a challenge to look beyond the surface level stuff, beyond the headlines and the simple explanations,
Right.
and really face the complicated and sometimes uncomfortable truths of history.
We have to listen to the voices that are often silenced, the perspectives that challenge what we think we know,
Yeah.
the ones that force us to confront the hard parts.
The Alaska Purchase, for all its importance on the world stage, really comes down to a human story.
Yeah, it does.
It's a story about ambition and opportunity, but also about lost resilience in this constant fight for justice.
And as we wrap up this exploration, we want to leave you with something to think about.
What if land ownership wasn't part of the equation?
Mm.
How do you think things would have gone differently between the Native Alaskans and the U.S. government?
It's a hypothetical question, of course,
Right.
but it's worth thinking about.
Yeah.
It makes us consider other possibilities to imagine a world where colonialism and exploitation weren't the driving forces behind these big historical events.
And if this deep dive into the Alaska Purchase has made you want to learn more, we encourage you to subscribe to the Deep Dive for more fascinating looks into history, told through the experiences of individuals and the voices that are often overlooked.